The morning I woke up to find Patricia Henderson standing in my driveway taking photographs of my snow-clearing pattern. I knew my peaceful life in Breckenridge, Colorado, was about to get a whole lot more complicated. I had moved to this mountain town 6 months ago, buying a modest 3-bedroom house in the Pinecrest Estates development. The view of the Rockies from my bedroom window made the mortgage worth every penny. What I hadn't factored into my decision was that Pinecrest Estates came with one of the most militant homeowners associations in Summit County. Patricia Henderson, a 52-year-old woman with an asymmetrical blonde bob and the kind of thin-framed glasses that screamed middle management, served as the HOA president with the enthusiasm of someone who had finally found their calling after years of searching. That February morning, I stood at my kitchen window in my thermal pajamas, watching Patricia squat down to get a close-up shot of the snow pattern I had shoveled the night before. I had cleared my driveway in straight lines from top to bottom, the same way I had been doing it since I moved in. The same way any rational human being would clear a driveway. My phone buzzed on the counter. An email from the Pinecrest Estates HOA. Subject line: Violation notice, improper snow removal technique. I opened it, my coffee growing cold in my hand, as I read through the most absurd document I had encountered in my 34 years of life. According to Patricia's meticulously worded notice, Section 14.7.3 of the HOA bylaws stated that all snow removal must be conducted in a manner that promotes proper water drainage and maintains aesthetic uniformity throughout the community. My vertical clearing pattern, she claimed, created unsightly lines that did not align with the horizontal clearing patterns preferred by the Architectural Review Committee. I read it 3 times to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. They were telling me which direction to shovel my driveway. I threw on some clothes and walked outside just as Patricia was packing her camera into her oversized designer purse. The cold hit me immediately, that dry mountain cold that makes your nostrils stick together when you breathe. "Morning, Patricia," I called out, trying to keep my voice level. She turned, and I saw her face transform into what I can only describe as weaponized politeness. "Good morning, Oliver. I trust you received my email." I did. "I'm a little confused, though. You're saying I shoveled my driveway wrong." Patricia's smile tightened. "Not wrong, Oliver. Non-compliant. There's a difference. We have standards in Pinecrest Estates. When you purchased your home, you agreed to abide by our community guidelines." I read the guidelines, all 700 pages of them. I don't remember anything about snow shoveling direction. "Section 14.7.3, she repeated, as if the numbers themselves were an explanation. "The revision was approved at last month's board meeting. We sent out an email to all residents." I pulled out my phone and searched my inbox. Sure enough, buried beneath promotional emails and newsletters was a message from the HOA dated 3 weeks prior. The subject line read, "Updated Community Standards Action Required," and the body contained a 17-page PDF attachment. Who reads 17-page PDF attachments from their HOA? "Patricia, this is ridiculous. It's snow. I'm clearing it. What difference does the direction make?" Her expression hardened. "The difference, Oliver, is that when we have standards, we maintain them. Otherwise, what's to stop someone from letting their grass grow too long? Or painting their house an unapproved color? Or parking an RV in their driveway? We have these rules for a reason. Those things I understand, but telling me which way to push a shovel, the fine for non-compliance starts at $200 for the first offense. I'd suggest you re-clear your driveway before the next snowfall. Have a blessed day." She walked to her white Lexus SUV, which was, I noted with some satisfaction, parked slightly crooked at the curb. I stood there in the cold, watching her drive away, feeling something dark and mischievous beginning to form in my mind. If Patricia wanted to dictate how I cleared my driveway, then I would clear my driveway exactly as requested. And then some. The forecast called for snow that night. 8 to 10 inches. Perfect. I spent the afternoon at the hardware store in town picking up some supplies. A new ergonomic snow shovel with an adjustable handle, some marking flags, a measuring tape. The clerk, an older gentleman named Pete who had lived in Breckenridge his entire life, asked what I was working on. Complying with my HOA, I said. He shook his head. Say no more. We get a lot of that up here. Rich folks move to the mountains, then spend all their time trying to make it look like a suburb in Denver. No offense if you're one of them. None taken. I actually like the mountains the way they are. Then why are you in an HOA neighborhood? Seemed like a good idea at the time. Pete laughed. Famous last words. Good luck with whatever you're planning. That night I stayed up watching the snow fall. It came down heavy and consistent, the kind of snow that makes everything quiet. By midnight, there was already 6 inches accumulating on my driveway. By 4 in the morning, when I finally saw the snowplows making their rounds through the neighborhood, we had gotten a solid 10 inches. I set my alarm for 6 and managed a few hours of restless sleep, dreaming of snow mazes and Patricia's disapproving face. When I woke up, the neighborhood was still quiet. I made coffee, ate a quick breakfast, and bundled up in my winter gear. Then I grabbed my new shovel, my marking flags, and headed out into the pristine white canvas that was my driveway. I started with the guidelines. Horizontal clearing as specified. I shoveled the first strip along the garage door, pushing the snow to the left. Then the second strip, parallel to the first. Then the third. Beautiful horizontal lines, exactly as the HOA Architectural Review Committee preferred. But I didn't stop there. Once I had cleared the main driving path with proper horizontal strokes, I began to add to the design. I shoveled out a path that branched to the right, then curved back toward the center. Then another path that went left before doubling back. I created intersections, dead ends, and loops. I carved out a spiral in one corner. I made pathways that seemed to lead somewhere but ended abruptly. I spent 4 solid hours in the morning cold, my back aching and my arms burning, creating an elaborate maze pattern throughout my driveway. The main driving path remained clear and properly horizontal, technically compliant with Patricia's specifications. But surrounding it was an intricate network of shoveled paths that turned my driveway into something that looked like a puzzle or perhaps a piece of abstract art. By the time I finished, a few neighbors had emerged to clear their own driveways. I saw Tom from across the street pause mid-shovel to stare at my creation. Linda and Dave from next door came out together, and Linda actually laughed out loud when she saw it. I waved to them and went inside to warm up, feeling more satisfied than I had in months. It took Patricia less than an hour to show up. I was on my second coffee, sitting by the window, when her Lexus pulled up. She got out of the car slowly, her phone already in her hand, taking photos from multiple angles. I watched her walk the perimeter of my property, documenting everything. Then she marched up to my front door and knocked hard enough that I thought she might break the glass. I took my time answering. "Oliver Lawson," she said, my full name somehow sounding like an accusation. "What is this?" "Snow removal. Horizontal pattern as specified in section 14.7.3. The main driving path is completely compliant." Her face was turning an impressive shade of red. "You know exactly what I mean. This is mockery. This is deliberate non-compliance. Actually, it's art. I call it compliance. The main pathway is cleared horizontally. Everything else is decorative. There's nothing in the bylaws about decorative snow removal patterns. There are guidelines about maintaining community aesthetics. And I think this looks great, very aesthetic. Several neighbors have already complimented me on it. This was technically true. Tom had given me a thumbs up, and Linda had said it was the funniest thing she had seen all year. Patricia's jaw clenched. This is not over. I'm calling an emergency board meeting. You'll be hearing from our lawyers. Looking forward to it. She stomped back to her car, and I noticed she nearly slipped on a patch of ice in her expensive leather boots. She caught herself, shot one more furious glare at my house, and drove off. I should have felt worried. Instead, I felt alive. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for that Saturday at the community center, a modern building near the entrance of Pinecrest Estates that the HOA used for meetings and the occasional social event. The email invitation made it clear that attendance was mandatory for all parties involved in compliance disputes. I showed up 10 minutes early wearing jeans and a flannel shirt, my standard off-work uniform. I worked remotely as a software developer, which meant I spent most of my time in comfortable clothes, coding from my home office with a view of the mountains. It was one of the reasons I had moved here, to have that perfect combination of solitude and scenery. The community center meeting room was set up like a courtroom, with a long table at the front where Patricia sat flanked by 4 other board members. I recognized 2 of them. Richard Grant, a retired investment banker who had the permanent expression of someone smelling something unpleasant, and Susan Clark, a real estate agent who always wore pantsuits in aggressive colors. The other 2 board members were strangers to me. About 15 residents sat in the audience chairs, apparently having shown up for the entertainment value of watching someone get roasted by the HOA board. Patricia called the meeting to order with a small gavel that she tapped against the table with unnecessary force. This emergency session has been called to address a clear violation of community standards by resident Oliver Lawson of 847 Pinecrest Drive. Mr. Lawson, you've been issued a notice regarding improper snow removal technique. Rather than correct the violation, you've chosen to escalate the situation with what can only be described as a childish display of defiance. She pulled up photos on a projector screen, showing my maze pattern from various angles. Several people in the audience murmured appreciatively. One person, I noted, was taking photos of the projector screen with their phone. As you can see, Patricia continued, this is clearly intended to mock the authority of this board and undermine the community standards we work hard to maintain. May I respond? I asked. Patricia looked like she wanted to say no, but Richard leaned over and whispered something to her. She nodded curtly. I stood up. First, the main driving path on my driveway is cleared in a horizontal pattern, exactly as specified in Section 14.7.3. Second, there is no provision in the HOA bylaws that prohibits decorative snow arrangements on private property. I've read all 700 pages of the governing documents, and the only requirements are that snow be cleared from driveways and walkways in a timely manner, and that the clearing method promotes proper drainage. My driveway drains perfectly fine. Susan Clark spoke up. The intent of the rule is to maintain aesthetic uniformity. The rule doesn't say that. It specifically mentions drainage and clearing. If the board wanted to restrict decorative snow patterns, that should have been explicitly stated in the bylaws. Patricia's face was getting red again. Are you seriously arguing that your little maze is decorative? Absolutely. In fact, I'd argue it adds character to the neighborhood. Based on the positive feedback I've received from neighbors, I'd say it's been well received. Tom from across the street raised his hand. I think it looks cool. Patricia shot him a withering look, and he lowered his hand quickly. Richard Grant cleared his throat. Regardless of the technical compliance, Mr. Lawson, the board has the authority to issue reasonable restrictions on property modifications and alterations that affect community appearance. We could easily draft an amendment to explicitly prohibit this type of behavior. You could, I agreed. But that would require a vote of the full HOA membership according to your bylaws. Articles of amendment require a 60% majority vote of all residents, not just the board. And that process typically takes at least 90 days. We're in February. By the time you could pass such an amendment, snow season would be over. I had done my homework. The board members exchanged looks. Patricia's expression suggested she was imagining various violent scenarios involving me and snow shovels. Fine, she said finally. The board will consider appropriate responses to this situation. In the meantime, Mr. Lawson, consider this your official warning that any further violations will result in the maximum fines allowable under our governing documents. Which violations specifically? Any that apply, she snapped. The meeting adjourned badly, with Patricia banging her gavel like she was trying to drive a nail through the table. As people filed out, several neighbors gave me subtle nods of approval. Tom caught up with me in the parking lot. Man, that was beautiful, he said quietly. Patricia has been making everyone miserable for years. Last month she tried to fine me because my Christmas lights were 3 days late coming down. 3 days. She seems to really enjoy the power. That's an understatement. Her husband left her 2 years ago, and she's been taking it out on the neighborhood ever since. The HOA is her whole life now. That's kind of sad. It is. But it doesn't mean she gets to make the rest of us miserable. What are you going to do for the next snowfall? I grinned. I have some ideas. The next snow came 4 days later, this time only about 6 inches. I waited until evening after the plows had gone through and cleared my driveway in what I called the spiral pattern. The main driving path remained horizontal and compliant, but I added a large spiral design in the unused portion of my driveway, creating concentric circles that resembled a nautilus shell. Patricia issued another violation notice. I ignored it. The snow after that, I created a geometric pattern with sharp angles and intersecting lines that looked vaguely Aztec. Another violation notice. Then I did a sunburst pattern, a grid of perfect squares, a series of zigzags that spelled out the word comply when viewed from above. Each time, the main driving path remained technically compliant with the horizontal clearing requirement. And each time, Patricia became more furious. The neighborhood was divided. Some residents thought I was being immature and making things harder for everyone. But a growing number were enjoying the entertainment value, and the way I was highlighting how absurd some of the HOA rules had become. Linda and Dave from next door invited me over for dinner one evening in early March. They lived in a beautiful 2-story with a view that made even my place look modest. We wanted to thank you, Linda said as she served pasta. You're doing what a lot of us have wanted to do for years. Taking on Patricia. Taking on the whole ridiculous system, Dave added. When we moved here 5 years ago, the HOA was reasonable. It enforced the basics. Keep your yard maintained, don't paint your house neon green, that sort of thing. But then Patricia took over as president, and she's been adding new rules constantly. It's like she thinks she's running a military base. Why doesn't anyone run against her for president? Linda and Dave exchanged glances. People have tried, Linda said, but Patricia controls the proxy votes. She gets everyone who can't attend the meetings to sign over their voting rights to her. Plus, she's made it clear that anyone who opposes her gets extra scrutiny. Tom tried to run against her last year, and suddenly, he was getting violation notices for things like having his garage door open during the day or parking his car at the wrong angle in his own driveway. That's harassment. It is, Dave agreed, but proving it is hard. She always has some bylaw to point to, some technicality that makes her actions seem legitimate. Has anyone thought about legal action? Too expensive. The HOA has insurance and lawyers on retainer. The rest of us would have to pay out of pocket. Most people just put up with it and count down the days until they can sell and move somewhere without an HOA. I thought about this as I walked home later that night. Patricia wasn't just annoying, she was actively making people's lives worse. The HOA, which should have been a tool for maintaining reasonable community standards, had become her personal fiefdom. I needed to escalate. The next major snowfall came a week later, and it was a big one. 14 inches overnight, with drifts up to 2 feet in some areas. The plows worked through the night, and by morning, Pinecrest Estates looked like a Christmas card. I got up early and started working. This time, I wasn't just making patterns. I was creating a full maze. It took me 7 hours. I cleared my main driving path first, horizontal and compliant. Then I spent the rest of the morning and early afternoon creating an elaborate maze that covered every inch of my driveway and extended slightly onto my front yard. The paths were wide enough to walk through, and the maze had multiple routes, dead ends, and even a small central chamber where I placed a garden chair. When I finished, I put a sign at the entrance. Free maze. All welcome. Stay on paths, please. The response was immediate and overwhelming. By mid-afternoon, kids from the neighborhood were running through the maze, laughing and trying to find the center. Parents came out with their phones to take pictures. Someone posted it on social media, and by evening, people from outside Pinecrest Estates were driving up to check it out. Tom brought his family over, and his kids spent an hour playing in the maze, their cheeks red from the cold and their faces glowing with joy. Linda and Dave came by with hot chocolate to share. Even some of the residents who had been neutral or critical before stopped to admire the work. It was the most community interaction I had seen since moving to Pinecrest Estates. People were talking to each other, laughing together, sharing a moment of simple joy in the middle of winter. And then Patricia showed up. She arrived in her Lexus, accompanied by Richard Grant and Susan Clark. The three of them stood at the edge of my property taking photos and notes. I walked over to greet them. Evening, Patricia. Richard. Susan. Would you like to try the maze? Patricia's expression could have frozen the ocean. This is unacceptable, Oliver. You've turned your property into a public attraction without board approval. Section 22.4 clearly states that no commercial enterprise may be operated from residential property. It's not commercial. It's free. Says so right on the sign. You're creating traffic and disturbances in the neighborhood. I looked around at the families enjoying the maze, the kids laughing, the neighbors chatting pleasantly with each other. Seems like people are enjoying themselves. Isn't community engagement supposed to be a good thing? Richard stepped forward. Mr. Lawson, you're deliberately antagonizing the board. This needs to stop. What needs to stop? Me clearing my driveway, because I am clearing it. In fact, I'd argue I'm clearing it more thoroughly than anyone else in the neighborhood. Susan tried a different approach, her voice taking on a fake sweetness. Oliver, we understand you're new to the community. Maybe you don't fully appreciate how things work here. We have standards and expectations. If everyone did whatever they wanted, we'd have chaos. Right now, we have children playing and neighbors talking. If that's chaos, I'll take it over whatever sterile conformity you're trying to enforce. Patricia stepped closer, her voice dropping to something that almost sounded threatening. "You will remove this maze by tomorrow morning, or we will fine you $500 per day until you comply. Furthermore, the board is filing a lawsuit against you for willful and repeated violations of HOA covenants. You'll be hearing from our attorney. Looking forward to it." They left, but the damage was done. Their presence had cast a shadow over the evening. Some families started packing up to leave, not wanting to be caught in the crossfire. Within an hour, the crowd had dispersed, and I was left alone with my maze as the sun set behind the mountains. The lawsuit notice arrived 3 days later via certified mail. The Pinecrest Estates, HOA, was suing me for $15,000 in accumulated fines and legal fees, plus demanding that I cease all unauthorized decorative snow removal activities and submit all future snow clearing plans to the Architectural Review Committee for approval before implementation. It was absurd. It was also potentially serious. I called a lawyer, a woman named Rebecca Morgan who specialized in HOA disputes. Her office was in Breckenridge, in a converted Victorian house near the town center. She was in her 40s, with gray streaks in her dark hair and the weary expression of someone who had seen every possible way people could make each other miserable over property rules. "So they're suing you for clearing your driveway creatively," she said after I explained the situation. "Essentially, yes." She flipped through the HOA documents I had brought. "The good news is that most of their case is garbage. You're technically compliant with the snow removal requirements, and there's nothing in the bylaws that explicitly prohibits decorative patterns. The bad news is that HOA boards have a lot of leeway in interpreting their own rules, and judges often defer to their judgment unless there's clear evidence of discrimination or harassment. So what do I do? We file a response denying their claims and arguing that your activities fall within the acceptable use of your property. We could also potentially countersue for harassment and abuse of authority, but that's a harder case to make unless we can show a pattern of targeting you specifically. Patricia has been issuing violation notices since this started. I have all of them. That helps. But we need to show that she's treating you differently than she treats other residents. You have evidence of that. I thought about Tom's story of being targeted after running against Patricia. I might be able to get testimony from other residents. Rebecca nodded. Start gathering that. In the meantime, I'll draft a response to the lawsuit. This is probably going to cost you a few $1,000s in legal fees, even if we win. HOA disputes are expensive, which is why boards like yours can often bully residents into compliance. Most people can't afford to fight back. I can afford it, I said. And more importantly, I'm tired of letting people like Patricia push everyone around. She smiled slightly. Good. Because this is going to get worse before it gets better. She was right. Patricia started showing up at my house at random times, documenting anything she could possibly construe as a violation. My trash cans were out 6 minutes past the allowed time one morning, earning me a $50 fine. A package left on my porch for 2 hours became an unsightly storage violation. She even tried to fine me for having icicles hanging from my gutters, claiming they constituted a safety hazard that I was responsible for removing. I documented everything. Photos, timestamps, copies of every ridiculous notice. Rebecca assured me it was all helping build our harassment case, but the psychological wear was real. Coming home from the grocery store to find Patricia taking pictures of my house got old fast. Having to carefully time every action to avoid giving her ammunition was exhausting. I started to understand why so many residents just gave up and fell in line. Then Tom knocked on my door one evening in late March. "I want to help," he said. "With your lawsuit. I'll testify about how Patricia targeted me, and I've been talking to other neighbors. There are at least a dozen people who have similar stories. We want to support you." This was the breakthrough we needed. Over the next 2 weeks, Tom helped me organize a meeting with residents who had been on the receiving end of Patricia's enforcement regime. We met at a coffee shop in downtown Breckenridge, away from Pinecrest Estates and Patricia's eyes. The stories were worse than I expected. One couple had been fined repeatedly for having the wrong shade of white paint on their trim, even though they had used the exact brand specified in the guidelines. Another resident had been cited for having an unapproved garden gnome in their backyard, which wasn't visible from the street. Someone else had been fined for parking their car in their own driveway at an angle Patricia deemed improper. The pattern was clear. Patricia used the HOA rules as a weapon, interpreting them as strictly as possible and targeting anyone who showed any independence or questioned her authority. "Why hasn't anyone gone to the police?" I asked. Linda answered. "Because technically she's not breaking any laws. The HOA has the legal authority to enforce its rules. As long as she can point to some bylaw or guideline, she's covered. It's abusive, but it's legal." "What if we all just refuse to pay the fines?" "The HOA can put liens on our houses," Dave explained. "Eventually, they could even force a foreclosure. Most people can't risk losing their homes over HOA fines." We were in a trap, one that was perfectly legal and devastatingly effective. "Then we change the HOA," I said. "Patricia's term as president is up when—" Tom checked his phone. "The annual election is in 2 months, May 15th. So we run a slate of candidates and vote her out." I tried that, remember. She controls the proxy votes. "Then we make sure everyone shows up to vote in person. We can't let her collect proxies. We need to run a real campaign and get people engaged." Susan Clark, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. She wasn't the same Susan from the board. This was Susan Miller, a teacher who lived 3 streets over. That could work, but we'd need someone willing to run against her, and they'd have to be prepared for Patricia to make their life hell in the process. Everyone looked at me. "Absolutely not," I said. "I'm already in a lawsuit. I don't need to add campaigning to the mix." "You're the only one she can't push around," Tom said. "The rest of us, we have families, jobs we have to get to, kids in local schools. We're vulnerable. You work from home, you're single, and you've already shown you're willing to stand up to her." "I moved here for peace and quiet, not to run an HOA." Linda leaned forward. "If you win, you could change the HOA, make it what it's supposed to be. A reasonable organization that maintains basic standards without making everyone miserable. Isn't that better than living under Patricia's dictatorship?" I sat back, weighing the decision. The smart move was to keep my head down, fight the lawsuit, and then just comply with whatever rules existed. The trouble-making part of me, the part that had built snow mazes just to annoy Patricia, wanted to burn the whole corrupt system down. "If I do this," I said slowly, "I'm going to need help. I'll need a full slate of candidates for the board. I'll need people knocking on doors, talking to neighbors, making sure everyone knows what's at stake, and I'll need everyone here to show up and vote, no matter what." Heads nodded around the table. "Okay," I said, "let's do this." The next 2 months were intense. We formed what Tom jokingly called the Pinecrest Liberation Front, organizing our campaign like a legitimate political movement. We recruited candidates for all 5 board positions. Myself for president, Tom for vice president, Linda for treasurer, Dave for secretary, and Susan Miller for member at large. We printed flyers outlining our platform: reasonable enforcement of essential rules, elimination of petty violations, transparency in board decisions, and a full review of all existing bylaws to remove absurd provisions. We went door to door, talking to every resident we could reach. Patricia, predictably, went nuclear. She called her own emergency meetings, circulated letters claiming we were trying to destroy property values, and started a whisper campaign about how I was an anarchist who wanted to turn Pinecrest Estates into a slum. She issued new violation notices against me and several of our campaign volunteers, trying to drain our time and energy. But something unexpected happened. The more Patricia pushed, the more residents pushed back. People who had been silent for years started speaking up about their grievances. The lawsuit against me became public knowledge, and the absurdity of an HOA suing a resident for snow patterns struck many people as the perfect example of everything wrong with Patricia's leadership. Rebecca, my lawyer, worked the legal angle. She filed a motion to dismiss the lawsuit, arguing that the HOA's claims were frivolous and constituted harassment. She also submitted all the testimony from other residents, showing a pattern of vindictive enforcement. The hearing was scheduled for May 10th, 5 days before the HOA election. The courtroom in Breckenridge was smaller than I expected, with wooden benches and large windows that looked out toward the mountains. Judge Margaret Chen presided, a woman in her 60s with a reputation for being no-nonsense and fair. The HOA's lawyer, a slick guy named Bradley Morrison from a firm in Denver, presented their case first. He argued that HOA rules existed for a reason and that residents like me who flagrantly disregarded them threatened the entire community structure. Mr. Lawson's behavior, Morrison said, represents a deliberate and ongoing effort to undermine the legitimate authority of the homeowners association. His so-called snow mazes created traffic, disturbed neighbors, and violated multiple provisions of the community covenants. The board has not only the right but the obligation to enforce consequences. Rebecca stood for our response. Your Honor, this case is fundamentally about whether an HOA can enforce rules that don't exist. My client cleared his driveway. He cleared it thoroughly, and in a manner that satisfied the only actual requirement in the bylaws, that snow be removed from driveways in a timely manner. The board's claim that he violated aesthetic standards is based on a provision about drainage, not appearance. There is no rule prohibiting decorative snow patterns. The rule requires aesthetic uniformity, Morrison interjected. Show me where it says that, Rebecca challenged. The actual text of Section 14.7.3 mentions drainage and timely removal, nothing more. The board is attempting to read requirements into the bylaws that simply aren't there. Moreover, we have evidence that the board president, Patricia Henderson, has engaged in a pattern of selective and retaliatory enforcement against my client and others who have questioned her authority. She submitted our documentation, the timeline of violation notices that coincided with my snow maze activities, testimony from other residents about similar targeting, photos showing that other residents had done things Patricia claimed to be violations without receiving any notices. Judge Chen reviewed the materials in silence for several long minutes. Finally, she looked up. I've seen a lot of HOA disputes, she said. Most of them involve legitimate disagreements about property maintenance or modifications that genuinely affect neighbors. This case involves snow patterns. Temporary decorations made of frozen water that melted within days or weeks. Mr. Morrison, you're asking this court to award your client $15,000 because Mr. Lawson shoveled his driveway in a creative manner that violated no explicit rule in your governing documents. Do I have that right? Morrison shifted uncomfortably. Your Honor, it's about the principle of enforcement. If residents can simply ignore rules they don't like, What rule did he ignore? Be specific. Point me to the exact language that prohibits what he did. Morrison flipped through papers. Section 14.7.3 requires proper drainage and aesthetic considerations. It requires drainage, period. The word aesthetic appears nowhere in that section. I've read it. And even if it did, aesthetic judgments are inherently subjective unless you have very specific objective standards spelled out in your documents, which you don't. She turned to the evidence of Patricia's enforcement pattern. What concerns me more is this pattern of selective enforcement. Miss Henderson appears to have issued violation notices to Mr. Lawson and others at a rate far exceeding what she applies to compliant residents. That suggests these rules are being used as tools of harassment rather than legitimate community governance. She set down the papers and looked at Morrison directly. I'm granting Mr. Lawson's motion to dismiss. The HOA's claims lack merit. Furthermore, I'm ordering the HOA to pay Mr. Lawson's legal fees in the amount of, she glanced at Rebecca's filing, $4,200. And I'm putting the Pinecrest Estates HOA board on notice that any further frivolous litigation or harassment of residents may result in more serious sanctions. She banged her gavel. We're adjourned. I walked out of that courtroom feeling 10 feet tall. Rebecca shook my hand and congratulated me, but warned that this wasn't over. Patricia can still make trouble through the HOA, she said. The judge dismissed the lawsuit, but she can't force the HOA to change its internal policies. That's up to the residents. Then we win the election, I said. News of the court decision spread through Pinecrest Estates quickly. Tom texted me that evening saying 3 more residents had committed to voting for our slate. Linda reported that she'd overheard conversations at the grocery store about how Patricia had finally gone too far. But Patricia wasn't finished. With 5 days until the election, she called a special assessment meeting, proposing that all residents pay an additional $2,000 to cover the legal fees the HOA had been ordered to pay me. When residents objected, she claimed that if the assessment didn't pass, the HOA would be forced to cut essential services like snow plowing and landscaping. It was a transparent attempt to make me the villain, to turn residents against me by making me financially responsible for the HOA's problems. Some residents fell for it. I received several angry calls and emails from people who blamed me for the assessment, but most people saw through it. The $2,000 assessment was a choice Patricia was making, not an inevitable consequence. The HOA had reserves precisely for situations like this. Using the assessment as a weapon only reinforced that Patricia was more interested in revenge than governance. The day of the election, May 15th, arrived with perfect spring weather. Snow had melted weeks ago, replaced by the brief flowering season that makes mountain spring so spectacular. The meeting was scheduled for 7 in the evening at the community center. Tom, Linda, Dave, Susan, and I arrived early to set up. We had prepared a presentation outlining our platform and answering common questions. We had handouts summarizing the key changes we wanted to make. We were as ready as we could be. Residents started arriving at 6:30. By 7, the community center was packed. Every chair was filled with people standing along the walls. I had never seen this many residents at an HOA meeting. Usually, these things drew maybe 20 people. Tonight, there were at least 100. Patricia sat at the front table with her current board, looking calm, but I could see tension in her shoulders. She knew this was different. She called the meeting to order at 7 sharp. Before we proceed to elections, Patricia began, I want to address some of the false narratives that have been circulating about this board's performance. We have worked tirelessly to maintain the high standards that make Pinecrest Estates a desirable community. Property values here have increased 20% since I became president, and that's not an accident. It's because we enforce our standards. Richard Grant nodded vigorously beside her. A few loyal supporters in the audience applauded. However, Patricia continued, there are some who would prefer chaos to order. Who would rather turn our community into a circus than maintain the dignity and beauty we've worked so hard to achieve? I urge you all to consider carefully who you want leading this community. Do you want experience and proven results, or do you want recklessness and mockery? She sat down, and it was our turn. I stood up, my heart pounding. Public speaking had never been my strength, but this mattered too much to screw up. My name is Oliver Lawson, and I'm running for HOA president. I moved to Pinecrest Estates 6 months ago because I fell in love with this place. The mountains, the community, the beauty of living here. What I didn't expect was that living here would mean constantly looking over my shoulder, worried that I might accidentally violate some obscure rule and get fined. I didn't expect that clearing snow from my driveway would result in a lawsuit. Some laughter from the audience. I'm not against rules. Rules make sense when they protect our community and our property values, but rules should be reasonable, clearly defined, and enforced fairly. What we have now is a system where rules are interpreted arbitrarily and used as weapons against anyone who questions authority. That's not governance, that's control. I looked around the room, making eye contact with as many people as I could. If elected, my board will conduct a full review of all HOA bylaws and remove provisions that are vague, petty, or overly restrictive. We will enforce rules that matter: property maintenance, safety standards, significant aesthetic issues. But we won't fine people for having their trash cans out 15 minutes late or parking at the wrong angle in their own driveway. We'll treat residents like adults who care about their community, not like children who need constant supervision. I sat down to substantial applause. Not everyone was clapping, but more than I expected. Patricia stood for her rebuttal, her face tight. Those are pretty words. But leadership requires more than popularity. It requires the strength to make difficult decisions and enforce them even when they are unpopular. I've been that leader, and I'll continue to be if you re-elect me. The voting process took an hour. Everyone had to show proof of residency, and no proxies were allowed per HOA election bylaws when more than 50% of residents were present. Patricia had tried to argue that we should still accept her collected proxies, but the HOA's own lawyer advised that it would violate election procedures. We voted by secret ballot, with 3 neutral residents counting the votes in a separate room. The wait was agonizing. I stood outside the community center with Tom, Linda, Dave, and Susan, watching the sun set behind the mountains. Whatever happens, Linda said, you change things here. People are paying attention now, they're engaged. That matters. It matters more if we win, I said. At 8:30, the counting committee emerged. An older gentleman named Harold, who had lived in Pinecrest Estates since the development opened 15 years ago, held the results. Patricia called everyone back inside, and the room fell silent. Harold cleared his throat. For HOA president, Patricia Henderson received 43 votes. Oliver Lawson received 68 votes. The room erupted. Cheers from our supporters, shocked silence from Patricia's camp. I felt Tom clap me on the back hard enough to nearly knock me over. Harold continued with the other positions. Our entire slate won, though the margins were closer for some positions. The message was clear. Residents wanted change. Patricia sat frozen at the front table for a moment. Then she stood abruptly, gathered her papers, and walked out without a word. Richard and Susan followed her. The remaining board member, a quiet guy named Frank who had always seemed uncomfortable with Patricia's aggressive approach, stayed and congratulated us. "Thank God," Frank said quietly. "I've wanted to resign for a year, but I was afraid of what she'd do if I did." The transition period was supposed to be 30 days, with the new board officially taking over on June 15th. But Patricia made it clear she had no intention of making the transition smooth. She refused to return phone calls, didn't respond to emails, and when we scheduled a transition meeting, she didn't show up. We had to involve lawyers again. Rebecca sent a formal demand letter requiring Patricia to turn over all HOA documents, financial records, and property. The HOA's own attorney, who apparently had grown tired of Patricia's antics, sided with us and threatened Patricia with personal liability if she didn't comply. Finally, on June 10th, Patricia showed up at the community center with boxes of documents and the HOA's physical property. Letterhead, the official seal, keys to the community center, financial account information. She dumped everything on the table without organizing it. "Enjoy the mess," she said to me. "Let's see how popular you are when you actually have to do the work." "I'm looking forward to it," I replied. She left, and I didn't see her again in person for weeks. Taking over the HOA was like inheriting a house that had been trashed by the previous owners. Files were disorganized or missing. Financial records were technically present, but nearly impossible to follow. Contracts with service providers were scattered across multiple filing systems. Worse, we discovered that Patricia had been running the HOA like a personal fiefdom. She had approved several contracts with companies owned by her friends, paying above market rates for services like landscaping and snow removal. The HOA's reserve fund, which should have had over $100,000, was sitting at barely $30,000. "This is borderline embezzlement," Dave said as we reviewed the financial records. He had experience in accounting, which made him perfect for the treasurer role. "Can we prove it?" I asked. "Maybe, but it would require a forensic audit, and those are expensive. The question is whether it's worth pursuing, or if we should just focus on fixing things going forward." We decided to table the question until we had stabilized the HOA's operations. Our first official meeting as the new board focused on immediate changes: suspending all pending violation notices for review, establishing clear criteria for what constituted actual violations versus petty complaints, and renegotiating contracts with service providers to get better rates. We also passed a resolution requiring that any new rules or amendments go through a transparent review process with input from residents before being implemented. The response from the community was overwhelmingly positive. People felt heard for the first time in years. Residents started actually attending board meetings again, not because they were afraid of being targeted, but because they wanted to participate in community decisions. But not everyone was happy. Patricia's supporters, about 20 residents who genuinely believed she had been doing a good job, felt like we were destroying everything she had built. They formed what they called the Concerned Citizens of Pinecrest, holding separate meetings and discussing ways to oppose our changes. I tried to reach out to them, to explain that we weren't eliminating all rules, just making them more reasonable. Some were willing to listen. Others, like Richard Grant, remained hostile. The situation reached a crisis point in July when we announced that we were eliminating the rule about snow clearing direction. It had been the catalyst for everything, and removing it felt both symbolic and practical. Richard showed up at the board meeting where we voted on it, red-faced and angry. "You're destroying property values," he shouted. "These rules exist for a reason. When you eliminate standards, you get chaos. I guarantee you within a year this neighborhood will look like a trailer park. Richard, I said calmly, we're eliminating the rule about which direction people shovel snow. We're not eliminating rules about property maintenance or structural standards. Your house will be fine. You don't understand what it takes to maintain a quality community. Patricia understood. That's why property values increased under her leadership. Tom spoke up. Property values increased because the entire Breckenridge area saw appreciation. It had nothing to do with HOA rules. And even if it did, what's the point of high property values if residents are miserable? The vote passed 4-1, with only Susan Clark, who had apparently remained loyal to Patricia, voting against it. As summer progressed, something interesting happened. Pinecrest Estates became more of a community than it had been in years. Without the constant fear of violation notices, people relaxed. They spent more time outside, talking to neighbors, organizing informal gatherings. Kids played in the streets again. Property maintenance didn't collapse. Houses didn't fall apart. People continued taking care of their homes because they cared about where they lived, not because they were afraid of fines. We did enforce rules when necessary. One homeowner who stopped mowing their lawn for 2 months got a notice. Someone who started running what appeared to be a commercial auto repair business from their garage got contacted about zoning violations. But these were legitimate issues handled with conversation first and penalties only as a last resort. In August, I was working in my home office when my doorbell rang. I answered to find Patricia standing on my porch. She looked different, thinner, tired. Her trademark aggressive confidence seemed diminished. "Can I come in?" she asked quietly. I hesitated, then stepped aside. We sat in my living room, an awkward silence filling the space. "I came to apologize," Patricia said finally. "Not for everything. I still think some of what I did was right, but I let it go too far. I let the power become more important than the purpose." I didn't know what to say. "My husband left me because I became obsessed with the HOA," she continued. "I had nothing else in my life, so I made the HOA everything. Every rule, every violation, it made me feel like I mattered, like I had control over something. Patricia, I'm sorry about your husband. But that doesn't excuse how you treated people." "I know. I'm not asking for forgiveness, I'm just explaining. And I wanted you to know that some of the financial irregularities you probably found, those weren't intentional. I'm not good with accounting. I did my best, but I made mistakes." This was the moment where I had to decide who I wanted to be. The vindictive part of me wanted to tell her that her apology changed nothing, that she had made people miserable and deserved whatever consequences came her way. But the better part of me recognized that she was a person who had made mistakes, not a monster. "The financial issues will need to be resolved," I said. "But if they were mistakes rather than deliberate fraud, we can work with that. We might need you to help us understand some of the decisions you made and where money went." She nodded. "I can do that. As for the rest, what's done is done. You're not on the board anymore. You don't have that power. If you want to be part of the community going forward, you're welcome to participate like any other resident. But you need to let go of trying to control everything." "I'm moving," she said. "I put my house on the market last week. I can't stay here after everything. Too many people hate me." "They don't hate you, they hated what you did. There's a difference." She stood to leave. At the door, she turned back. "For what it's worth, your snow mazes were actually pretty impressive. The kids loved them." After she left, I sat for a long time thinking about power and control, and what happens when people lose sight of why rules exist in the first place. Patricia's financial cooperation helped us understand where the HOA's money had gone. Most of it was incompetence rather than malice. Overpaying for services because she didn't negotiate well, failing to collect dues from some residents while aggressively pursuing others, and poor investment decisions with the reserve fund. We didn't pursue legal action, but we did implement better financial controls and oversight. By September, Pinecrest Estates had transformed. Board meetings became boring again, in the best possible way. We discussed snow removal contracts and landscaping bids, instead of violation notices and lawsuits. Residents attended occasionally, but didn't feel compelled to show up in force to protect themselves. The ultimate test came with the first major snowfall in October, an early season storm that dropped 8 inches overnight. I got up early and cleared my driveway in whatever pattern seemed efficient. No mazes this time, no spirals or geometric designs. Just a clean driveway cleared in the way that made sense for the shape of my property. Several neighbors did the same, each using whatever pattern worked for them. Some went horizontal, some vertical, some in a combination. Nobody cared. The snow got cleared, and that's what mattered. Tom stopped by later that morning as I was finishing up. "No maze this year?" he asked with a grin. "Don't need to make a point anymore. Besides, it was exhausting. Do you know how much work it is to shovel a maze? I can imagine, though my kids are a little disappointed. They were hoping for another one. Maybe I'll do something special for Christmas. But the everyday snow clearing, I'm happy to just keep it simple." The following spring, at our annual HOA meeting, we presented our one-year report to residents. Property values had continued to increase at the same rate as before. Violation notices were down 92%. Resident satisfaction, based on a survey we conducted, was at the highest level anyone could remember. We also announced that we had rebuilt the reserve fund through better contract negotiations and careful budgeting, and we were suspending dues increases for the next 2 years. The meeting ended with something that had never happened at a Pinecrest Estates HOA gathering: spontaneous applause. As I drove home that night, windows down to let in the spring air, I thought about how strange the past year had been. I had moved to Breckenridge for peace and quiet, for mountains and solitude. Instead, I had found myself in the middle of an HOA war, fighting over snow patterns and bylaws, and the fundamental question of what kind of community people wanted to live in. I hadn't set out to be a leader or a revolutionary. I just wanted to shovel my driveway in peace. But sometimes standing up for something small leads to changing something big. Patricia did move. Her house sold in August, and I heard she relocated to Arizona, as far from Colorado snow as she could get. I hoped she found whatever she was looking for. The rest of us stayed and built something better. An HOA that did what it was supposed to do: maintain reasonable standards while letting people live their lives. Novel concept, apparently. When winter came again, I did make one special maze after the first big storm, this time inviting the whole neighborhood in advance. We turned it into a community event with hot chocolate and cookies. Kids ran through the maze while parents chatted, and neighbors who had barely spoken to each other discovered they had things in common. Someone took a photo from above using a drone and posted it online. It went viral locally, with the caption, "This is what HOAs should be: bringing people together, not tearing them apart." I printed the photo and hung it in my office, a reminder that sometimes the most important battles are fought over things as temporary and beautiful as patterns in snow. Standing in my driveway that winter evening, watching neighbors laugh and kids play, I realized I had found what I came to the mountains looking for after all. Not solitude exactly, but something better. A place where I belonged and could be myself, even if that meant occasionally shoveling elaborate maze patterns just because I felt like it. The mountains rose in the background, eternal and indifferent to our small human dramas. But down here in the valley, in this little development called Pinecrest Estates, we had learned something valuable. Rules matter, but people matter more. Community isn't built through control and conformity. It's built through respect, flexibility, and the simple recognition that we all want the same basic things. To feel safe, to feel heard, and to live our lives without someone constantly telling us we're doing it wrong. I stayed on as HOA president for 3 years, then stepped down to let someone else take the reins. The culture we had built continued, proving it wasn't about me personally, but about the principles we had established. On my last day as president, Tom organized a surprise party at the community center. Residents showed up with food and drinks, sharing stories about how the HOA transformation had improved their lives. Some were funny, some were touching. All of them reminded me why the fight had been worth it. Linda presented me with a custom snow shovel, engraved with the words "Compliance Artist." "For the man who turned snow removal into a revolution," she said, "I still live in Pinecrest Estates, still work from my home office with the view of the Rockies, still clear my driveway when it snows, usually in whatever pattern is most efficient, but occasionally, just for fun, in something more creative." The HOA continues doing what it's supposed to do, maintaining standards without making people miserable. Property values have remained strong. More importantly, people actually like living here now. Sometimes I see new residents moving in, and I make a point to welcome them. I tell them about the neighborhood, about the hiking trails nearby, about the best places to eat in Breckenridge. And if they ask about the HOA, I tell them the truth. We're reasonable, we're fair, and we don't care which direction you shovel your driveway. Usually they look relieved. Sometimes they look confused, wondering why that would even be a question. And I just smile and think about Patricia and Richard, and all the others who thought that controlling every detail of their neighbors' lives was what community meant. I think about how close Pinecrest Estates came to being permanently defined by that vision. But mostly, I think about snow mazes and children laughing and neighbors who became friends because we all stood up together and said enough was enough. The mountains are still here, ancient and beautiful. Pinecrest Estates is still here, flawed but functional. And I'm still here, living the quiet mountain life I wanted, earned through the most unlikely of battles. The great HOA snow war, as Tom still calls it. Sometimes peace has to be fought for. Sometimes it requires standing up to bullies and saying no, requires organizing and campaigning and refusing to back down. Sometimes changing the world starts with something as simple as shoveling your driveway in whatever pattern makes you happy. And sometimes, just sometimes, the pattern you create in the snow turns out to be the pattern for something much bigger. A community that actually works, where rules serve people instead of the other way around, where authority comes with responsibility and power comes with limits. That's what I learned in my first year at Pinecrest Estates. That's what I helped build in the years that followed. And that's what I'm proudest of when I look back on the whole ridiculous, frustrating, ultimately worthwhile experience. I came to the mountains looking for solitude. I found community instead. Not the fake, enforced community of perfectly manicured lawns and identical snow removal patterns, but real community, messy and complicated and built on respect rather than fear. And it all started because I refused to be told which direction to push a snow shovel.